All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking, excuse me, all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our TALMUD Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Jerry and Sora Wolasky, for dedicating all the Sherman Shoshos this month in the zechus for refuah, for Zecharya Dov, Ben Perel Shira, the Tilson and Wohl families from Eretz Yisrael for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashos this month in honor of the entire shir, and in Mazel Tov, we should be Zochem Eretz Hashem to be continuing to learn together for many years to come. To thank Shaindy and Avraham Kelman for dedicating all of his Sherman Shoshos this month in the memory of their beloved parents and in the zechus of all those who need a refuah shaleimah. To thank our Daf Yomi sponsors, Brian and Shoshi Ponczak, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Frieda Ponczak on the 11th of Elul, and Milton Melanie Gertner, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Milt's father, Gilbert Gertner, whose also yahrzeit is on the 11th of Elul. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the neshamas will have an aliyah and the families a nechama. But so with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Daf Tes Vav 15, and we are picking up in Eretz Hashem on Yudal Amud Beis 14b. We left off yesterday. Actually, it was a good run yesterday. So we left off my time at the Tanakama, which was 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 lines up from the bottom. So let's remember again, we had a fascinating machlokes between the Tanakama and Rabbi Elazar, going through a various list of distinctions between an Eved Ivri, of Mocher Atzmo, one who goes ahead and sells himself, versus Machru Bezdin, one who is sold by the Bezdin. So the Tanakama had a variety of distinctions between these two different types of Avadim. Ultimately, again, Rabbi Elazar said essentially, there's no distinction. They're treated the same. They're treated the same in halacha. Now, originally, remember again, the reason why the Gemara brought this up was because, remember, what's our overarching discussion? Our overarching discussion is we're trying to go ahead and figure out who is the Tana who does not subscribe to the Gzera Shava of Sachir. That's really what we were looking for over here. So originally we thought that was what was going on. That was the machlokes between Rabbi Elazar and the Tanakama. It turns out that's not the machlokes. Turns out the Gemara says everyone subscribes to Sachir. Now we're going to revisit that statement in just a little bit. But the machlokes between Rabbi Elazar and Tanakama is something totally different. So here we go. So my time with the Tanakama. What's the reason with the Tanakama that he says Damar Mocher Atzmo Nimkar L'Sheish V'Yes Sheish? So remember again, the Tanakama said that when one sells themselves, again, the minimum duration of servitude, 6 years. That's the floor. But when selling yourself, if you want to negotiate a longer term, you have the ability to do that. Contrast that with Machruhu Bezdin, when Bezdin sells you, 6 years, no more. So where does Tanakama get that from? See, he says, because when it comes to someone who was sold by Bezdin, the Torah says, Va'avdecha sheish shanim. Torah says when Bezdin sells you, you will work for the master for 6 years. Zeh v'lo mocher atzmo. So we'll say, so again, because that pasuk is written in the context of someone sold by Bezdin, what do you see from here? That I'm being sold by Bezdin, the floor and the ceiling is 6 years. That's it. There's no more. When you sell yourself, you can negotiate even for more. V'idach, the other opinion, Rabbi Elazar will say, va'avdecha lach v'lo liyoresh. So we'll say, Rabbi Elazar darshans it a different way. He says, va'avdecha teaches us that the Eved Ivri serves the master and not the inheritor. Meaning that if the master were to die, now there were to be a Yoresh, an inheritor, the inheritor does not inherit rights over the Eved Ivri. V'idach, the other opinion will say, Va'avdecha achrina ksiv. There's another Va'avdecha. V'idach, Halhu l'artzas adon huda asa. The other opinion will say, no, that second Avdecha is to come to appease the Adon. We'll talk about this more. Remember, when the Eved Ivri goes free, there's the concept of Hanaka. Hanaka means that the master gives the servant like some startup capital. So that might not be the easiest thing for the Adon to do. After all, again, remember, this Adon has already purchased the Eved. He supported the Eved over the course of his tenure as an Eved. Now when he leaves, he has to give him even more money. So the Torah gives another avdecha. This was your Eved to appease the Adon to give Hanaka. Fine. Why does the Tanakama hold that when one sells themselves, they don't get their ear pierced. In other words, that if they choose to stay on, right, after, if they choose to stay, if they would, in other words, that they can't stay on, and therefore they don't get their ear pierced, since ultimately, again, the Torah has an exclusionary phrase, by the Eved sold by Beis Din. What does it say? V'ratza Adonov es azno b'martzeya. So the pasuk, when talking about the Eved who was sold by Beis Din and wants to stay on past the 6 years, the Torah says his master will pierce his ear with the awl, martzeya, azno shalom, v'lo azno shlomocher atzmo. Only the ear of one who is sold by Beis Din, and not the ear of one who sells himself. Top of Tesvav. So we'll say the Gemara, just to see what's going to happen. So the Gemara is just going through all the psukim of the Machlokas in the Tanakama and Rabbi Lazar. Top of Tesvav, the Idach. Rabbi Lazar would say, Gzera Shava Da'asa. That pasuk actually comes to teaching Gzera Shava. What's the Gzera Shava? The Sanya, Rabbi Eliezer Omer. How do we know that when the master pierces the ear of the Eved, it's the right ear that's pierced? Ne'emar kan ozen, it says over here ozen by Eved, but ne'emar la'alon ozen. And I will say later on, the context of it, I will say ultimately again is the purification of the Metzora. And the Torah speaks about again the applications of the blood of the ear and of the big toe of the Metzora. Malahalon yamin, just like by the Metzora, it's applied on the right ear. Afkan yamin. So to over here, Azno teaches me that the piercing is done on the right ear. The idach. Where do the Rabbanon learn this out from? That the piercing is done on the right ear. Imkain lemakra ozen. Pasuk just said ozen ear. My ozno. Ozno Bosai teaches us the so to speak, the dominant ear. And what's the dominant ear? That's going to be the right ear. Okay, the idach. The other opinion would say, Homi baile azno velo azno. Rabbi Lazar would say, no, you need azno to teach you what? It's actually very interesting. Allah was saying, it is only the Eved Ivri who has his ear pierced, not the Amma Ivriya. In other words, the concept. So we might have a machlokas as to who has the right to stay on after 6 years, right? Is it all avadim, right? Every Eved Ivri, or maybe only an Eved Ivri sold by Beis Din, but not an Eved Ivri sold himself? Okay, it's not going to be a machlokas. One thing, interestingly enough, everyone agrees on, the concept of staying on past 6 years with an ear piercing is dafka an opportunity available to an Eved Ivri, not an Amma Ivriya. Not an Amma Ivriya. And the Torah, the Gemara understands, the Torah says this, azno, his ear, below azna, not her ear. Not her ear. Okay, we'll discuss this more. The other opinion will say, nafkale v'im yomar ha'eved v'lo ha'ama. The other opinion says you can learn this out from the pasuk that says that the pasuk says v'im yomar ha'eved. If the Eved says ahavti es adoni v'est ishti v'est manai, where the Eved says I love my master, right? I love my wife, I love my children. He's talking about again it's the shifcha kenanis and his children from her. I love all of them. I don't want to leave. The way that the Torah phrases it is that it's the Eved that's saying it, not the Amma. Okay, v'idach mi'bayle. Ultimately, the other opinion requires us to teach you ad sheyomar kishuhu Eved. So that's interesting. The other opinion says the other pasuk is necessary ultimately to teach me that halacha l'maisa, in order for the Eved to stay on, it's actually very interesting. He has to articulate his desire to remain in servitude while still an Eved. In other words, we'll say, if you can imagine the following scenario, unless you have an Eved Ivri, and his 6 years are up, and then after the 6 years are up, a day later, he's like, you know what, I really liked being an Eved. So I'd like to go back. Can't do it. The only ability to extend the term, ultimately, again, is while he is still an Eved. Incredible. V'idach me'eved ha'eved nafka. The other opinion learns that out from the fact that it doesn't say Eved, it says ha'eved. So the other opinion will say Eved ha'eved, lo darish. He doesn't darish an Eved ha'eved. Okay, fine. My time with the Tanakama damra mocher atzmo in. Ein manikin lo. So why is it that Tanakama held? We'll say that it is only an Eved who is sold by Beis Din who is given ha'naka. Remember again, we'll talk about ha'naka in greater depth, but ha'naka ultimately, Hanukkah is that when the Eved leaves servitude, his master gives him, again, livestock and wine and oil and grain to start him up in his new life. So why is it, according to the Tanna Kama, that only an Eved sold by Beis Din gets Hanukkah, but an Eved who sells himself doesn't get Hanukkah? What's the reason? Miyet Rachmana Kavi Machrua Beis Din, because the Torah, when discussing the Eved sold by Beis Din, says, Hanek Tanik Lo. Give him Hanukkah. Lo, only this Eved, the one sold by Beis Din, for lo lemocher asmo, and not the one who sells himself. So both say that's logic of Tanna Kama. V'idach, Rabbi Elazar will say, V'idach, homi baile lo v'lo liyarshav. So this is actually very interesting. So Rabbi Elazar learns that this teaches us that no, every Eved, whether he sells himself or he's sold by Beis Din, gets Hanukkah. What this means, Rabbi says, what happens? Imagine the following situation. Imagine Ruvain is an Eved Ivri. Okay, so what happens? Now Ruvain's tenure is coming to an end. Ruvain is freed, and now Ruvain dies. The master never got a chance to give Ruvain the Hanukkah. So ultimately, again, Rabbi Elazar will say, what that teaches me is Hanukkah is only something given to the Eved himself, not given to the heirs of the Eved. Below the Yarshav. So the Gemara says, Yarshav Hamaylo, why not? Why wouldn't you give the Hanukkah ultimately again to his inheritors? After all, again, Schir Karye Rachmana. Torah calls him a hired worker. Mas Socher Peulas Yarshav. But it just says, like if you have a hired worker who didn't get paid his wages and then he dies before he gets paid, his wages go to his offspring, to his inheritors. Av Hai Peulas Yarshav. Ultimately, an Eved also, his Hanukkah should go to his inheritors. Elalo v'lo lebal chovo. Rather, what it means is, if the Eved is entitled to Hanukkah, the Hanukkah only goes to him. The Hanukkah doesn't go to his creditor. Now, what does this mean? Now, this is fascinating. Midisvirlan ba'amak Rabbi Nassan. They say, in general, we've actually seen this concept before. In general, we hold it Rabbi Nassan. They say, what does Rabbi Nassan hold? What does Rabbi Nassan hold? Rabbi Nassan says as follows: the Sanya, Rabbi Nassan, minayin lenoshe bechavera maneh. But say, how do you know that if you lend your friend $1,000, right? V'chavera bechavera maneh, and that friend lends another friend $1,000. So what's happening over here is A lends B and B lends C. How do we know minayin shemotziyim mizevenos lens? I will say, how do you know that A has the ability to extract payment from C? Right? So A lends B, B lends C. Rabbi Nassan says A could go directly to C to extract payment for his debt. How do we know that? Talmud Lomar, V'Nassan la'asher asham lo. So we'll say this is the position of Rabbi Nassan. As, the Gemara says, Asa lo lafuke. Ultimately, again, Rabbi says, so in the case of Eved Ivri, Hanik Tanik Lo, Lo teaches me that halacha l'maisa, the master is only obligated to go ahead and give the Hanukkah to the Eved Ivri. But if the Eved Ivri has a creditor, the creditor could not come and claim the Hanukkah from the Adon in satisfaction of his debt. V'idach, the other opinion says, Ba'almanami lo sfrilak Rabbi Nassan. The other opinion would say, in general, I don't hold like Rabbi Nassan anyway. Okay. Next. My time in Tanna Kama, Damar Mocher Asmo in. Ein Rabba Mosel Shifcha Kananis. So we'll say, why is it? Tanna Kama holds that it is only by an Eved who is sold by Beis Din that the master has the right to give him a Shifcha Kananis, a non-Jewish maidservant, for procreation purposes. But an Eved who sells himself cannot be given a Shifcha Kananis, to which the Gemara says, very simple, Miyet Rachmana, Kabe Machrua Beis Din. Tanna Kama will say, because the Torah specifically said this, by an Eved sold by Beis Din. What did the Torah say? Im Adonav Yitain Lo Isha. Pasuk says, if the master will give him a wife, a Shifcha Kananis. Lo, v'lo lemocher atzmo, dafkatim. So the context is that it's talking about an Eved sold by Beis Din. Dafka, an Eved sold by Beis Din, and not an Eved who sells himself. Okay. V'idach, the other opinion will say, Lo bal karacho. The other opinion says, no. What does Lo teach me? That an Eved could even be given a Shifcha Kananis against his will. Meaning, let's say the Eved says, I don't have an interest and a shivcha kinanis, the master could still say, you do now. You do now. V'idach, michi mishna sachir, michi mishna sechar sachir nafka. The other opinion burns out this idea that it could begin a shivcha kinanis from the double lashon desanya, ki mishna sechar sachir avdecha. So the Gemara says, sachir eino, so it's interesting, the way the Torah refers to an eved is Mishnah Sechar Sachir. So we'll say, which means that he's like a double worker. What does it mean that an Eved Ivri is a double worker? He says, Sachir Eino Oved Elabayom. A regular hired worker is obligated to work by day. Eved Ivri Bein Bayom Bein Balayla. Eved Ivri works by day and by night. Now what does that mean? So do you think that a master can make his Eved Ivri work by day and by night? After all, we're going to talk about this more in depth. The Torah tells us that when you have an Eved Ivri, the halacha is kitov lo imach. It has to be good for him with you. What does it mean it has to be good for him with you? That you have to treat your Eved well. Imcha b'machol. Whatever you're eating, your Eved has to eat. Imcha b'mishta. Whatever you drink, your Eved has to drink. I will say this is an incredible halacha. We're going to talk more about this. That, I always mention this, whenever we speak about an Eved, slavery, right? So we translate Eved as a slave. So of course, again, slavery, and understandably so, always has such a terrible, oppressive connotation, right? The concept of slavery always like conjures up in our mind the images of one person exploiting another. That's why probably better than using the word slavery is probably the word servitude. But remember again, both for the Eved Kinani and for the Eved Ivri, there's a mechanism in place to ensure that one never exploits the servant. Now that's even more so in the case of an Eved Ivri, who really isn't a servant. An Eved Ivri really is a worker, is an employee. And that's the Torah says, when you have an Eved Ivri, whatever your standard of living is, you have to give your Eved Ivri the same exact standard of living. So whatever food you eat, that's what he eats. Whatever you drink, that's what he drinks. How wherever you're sleeping, that's where. So in other words, same standard of living. So the Gemara says. So therefore, how can you say that he's a Mishnah Sachar that he has to work both by day and by night? To which the Gemara says, V'amrav Yitzchak mikan sherabo moselo shivcha kinanis. What it means, no, is by day he's obligated to work for the master. At night, the master could, so to speak, put him to work. How? Giving him shivcha kinanis, producing offspring. The idach, the other opinion says, ime hasam, if it was from there, hava mina harimim midaite. I would have thought that's only if the Eved consents. Aval bal karcha imalo, but maybe if the Eved doesn't consent, the master can't give him a shivcha kinanis. Kamashwan, that's not the case. Fine. Sefer will say. So bottom line, we've just seen a fundamental machlokes between the Tanakama and Rabbi Lazar about is there a distinction between Mocher Atzmo, an Eved who goes ahead and sells himself, versus Machruhu Bezdin, versus an Eved who's sold by Bezdin. So according to the Tanakama, there is a fundamental distinction. According to Rabbi Lazar, there is not. And I will say, just as an aside, because it's actually quite interesting, how do we paskin? So the Rambam in Hilchos Avodim Perek Gimel Halacha Yud Beis says as follows. Here it is. Ma bein mocher asmo lemachru bezdin. What is the distinction between one who sold himself versus one who was sold by bezdin? Mocher asmo eino nirtza, machru bezdin nirtza. Here it is, Rosai. The Rambam Paskins, like the Tanakama, if one sells himself, he cannot stand it. He doesn't get his ear pierced. One who's sold by bezdin has the ability to stay on and get his ear pierced. Mocher asmo asa b'shivcha kinanis. Ultimately, again, one who sells himself cannot be given a Gentile maidservant. Machru Bezdin, Rabba Moso Shivcha Kinanis. Sold by Bezdin, master can give him a Shivcha Kinanis. Mocher, so again, the Rama then goes on, he says, Mocher Atzmo, Nimkar the Sheish v'Yesra al Sheish. Machru Bezdin, Elim Kol Sheish. If you sell yourself, you can enter into a contract again, floor of 6 years, you can negotiate for more. Machru Bezdin, if you're sold by Bezdin, you're only sold for 6 years. Mocher atzmo ein marnikelo. If you sold yourself, you do not get ha'anaka. Machru beis din. If you were sold by beis din, you do get ha'anaka. So we'll say it's interesting. We're going to. So again, the Rambam essentially passes like the Tanakama, with these fundamental distinctions between mocher atzmo machru beis din, rejects the position of Elazar. We'll say we will see later on as we go on in this a little bit that there's also a very strong psychological component in here about the fundamental distinction between one who sells himself and Chazal being very concerned, HaKadosh Baruch Hu being concerned about a person. We'll say, think about this just a moment. Who's the guy who sells himself? Right? Who's the guy who sells himself? The guy who sells himself is a person essentially, see, not necessarily every case, but selling yourself into servitude means either one of two things. Either you've exhausted every single other option to stand on your own 2 feet, or you're choosing not to exhaust every single option to stand on your own 2 feet and are taking a little bit of an easy way out by essentially putting responsibility for you on someone else. When you look at selling yourself that way, you can tell that what Chazal are careful with is, Chazal do not want to sweeten the deal for that guy. See, I will say, the mocha atzmo, again, I will say in general, one of the most important things in Yiddishkeit, right? One of the most important things is to be a self-sufficient person. To be a person who could stand on your own 2 feet. To be the kind of person who takes care of your own stuff, takes care of your own issues, doesn't outsource your success to anyone else. You take the reins of your life. I'll say, when a guy is mocher atzmo, when he sells himself into servitude, what is he effectively doing? He's telling someone else to take care of him. Torah doesn't like that. Now, again, sometimes is that necessary? Sometimes do you hit such a brick wall in life where I guess, again, you can't take care of yourself, you have to sell yourself into servitude? It could happen. But there's a fear that it's so easy to utilize this as an easy way out of dealing with your life issues. So because of that, you see that the Rambam is saying is HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, okay, we can't close the door to it, such a concept exists, but we're not going to sweeten the deal for you. There's no hanaka for you, right? And again, so we'll see more of it as we go on, but there's a lot of very strong life hashkafa in this as well. But let's go back there. So back to the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, so we are still back. Good. Ella, mantana hudiyo lo yolav sachir. So remember again, we go back to our original question, which is, remember the whole reason we got into this, shall I say, is because we were speaking about a gzeira shava of sachir. So just to reorient ourselves a little bit, what is that gzeira shava? So remember again, I will say, the Torah says by mocher atzmo, Torah uses lashon by one who sells themselves, kisacher kitoshav. The Torah also uses the lashon of sachir by machruhu beis din. So the gzeira shava of sachir essentially allows you to learn out all of the halachos of mocher atzmo to machru beis din and machru beis din to mocher atzmo. It essentially makes them, sachir makes them one uniform construct of avdus, of Jewish servitude. Okay, so the Gemara says, who is the one who rejects it? Who is the one who doesn't? So the Gemara says, Haitanhu. The sign of the pasuk says, "V'shava mishpachto," he will return back to his family. V'shava mishpachto. So we'll say, so the rest of the pasuk is v'yatsa me'ima hu ubanav imo v'shav al mishpachto. So this is talking about the emancipation, ultimately again, of the Eved Ivri. He will go back to his family. Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, b'ma chasam medaber. What does it start talking about? Even mocher atzmo, if it's talking about an Eved who sold himself, harik kvar amar. The pasuk already spoke about the emancipation of an Eved who sold himself. Ibn Yersa, if it's talking about an Eved whose ear was pierced, in other words, that he's going free by Yovel, harik kvar amar, ha'ina chasam medaber el b'machru beis din. So I was speaking about a case, it was an interesting case, of an Eved who was sold by beis din, shtayim v'shalosh shanim l'fnei hayovel. 2 or 3 years before Yovel, shayovel motzo, that Yovel emancipates him. So I will say, here's what's interesting. So it turns out that now there are two different mechanisms for emancipation, right? Number one, 6 years. 6 years, right? 6 years is the automatic duration of servitude when you buy an Eved Ivri. 6 years. After 6 years, he goes free. If the Eved's ear is pierced, right, he chooses to stay on, then what? His term is extended until Yovel. Now here's what's interesting. Yovel, however, emancipates all Avadim, no matter where they are in their term. So for example, if Beis Din sold an Eved, and now it's 3 years before Yovel, once Yovel comes, that Eved goes free, even though again he did not serve the minimum 6 years. So the Gemara says, and if you think that you have the Gzer Shav Sacher Sacher, Lamali, why do I need this pasuk? Neilif Sacher Sacher. I could just learn the Gzer Shav, and it would teach me that even an Eved sold by Beis Din ultimately goes out by Yovel. Amrav Nachman by Yitzchak li Olam Yolif Sacher Sacher. No, the Tanna Kama does hold of the Gzer Shava. The Itzrich, nevertheless, it's necessary. Sacher Daitchan Mina. I would have thought. Mocher Atzmo, Hu Delo Avid Isura. It's only by Mocher Atzmo, ultimately again, where the Eved didn't do anything wrong. See, I will say, remember, Machru, when do you get sold by Beis Din? When do you get sold by Beis Din? Right? If you stole and you don't have the ability to pay. Mocher Atzmo, again, it's not Avera, I'm just destitute. I don't have any money. So that's why I'm selling myself. So the Gemara says, Mocher Atzmo, Hu Delo Avid Isura. Only by Mochas we did commit this. Rabbi Machru Beis Din, but where ultimately again this person is sold by Beis Din. The Avadi Surah Ema Niknese. Maybe he should stay on even though the Yovel year comes. Kamash Mala know that even by the case of Machru Beis Din, where he's sold into servitude because of a transgression, when Yovel comes, he's emancipated. So the Gemara says, Amar Mar Ibn Irsa Hari Kvar Amar. So Gemara said, quoting from the Bible before, if it's talking about by pierced, that we already learned it. Mahi, where did we learn it before? The Sanya both say first why line on the bottom. The Sanya Vishavtem Ish Allah Chuzasov Ish Al Mishpachto. The pasuk says that ultimately again when Yovel comes, he will return back to his family. But Me'akasu B'Dabra, what is the pasuk talking about? I b'mocher atzmo. If it's talking about an Eved who sold himself, Hari Kvar Amar, we already learned that. Im Machru Beis Din, if somebody sold by Beis Din, Hari Kvar Amar. That was also said, Ha'ina Kasav Medaber Ela Benirtza Shtayim V'Shalosh Shanim Lefnei Yovel. Interesting. We'll say, what is the pasuk referring to? An Eved who was pierced, ultimately again 2 or 3 years before Yovel. The Gemara says, Shayovel Motzio, that even though the Eved was pierced, and normally a piercing keeps you in servitude until Yovel. If Yovel came 2 or 3 years after the piercing, halach l'maisa, you still go free. You still go free. So my mashma, where do we see this in the pasuk? Amar Bar Shila Amakra Ish Ezo Hu Davar Shenoi Beish Ve'inoi Beisha. What is something that applies to a man that doesn't apply to him? We saw this before. So the Gemara says, Havi Omer Zuritzia, piercing. Remember again, an Ama Ivriya is never pierced. So the Gemara says, "V'Itzrich lemichtav machru Beis Din, v'Itzrich lemichtav nirsa." And Abba says, so I need both of these psukim. I need to know that in the case of machru Beis Din, Yovel emancipates, even if it comes just a few years after the servitude began, and nirsa, even if he's pierced, and servitude begins just a few. And Yovel comes just a few years later that he's emancipated. I need them both. Why? Di ashmo'inon machru Beis Din. Because had it just spoken about the case of where he was sold by Beis Din, mishum delo mati zmanei, because the time has not yet come. Aval nirtza de mati zmanei, we'll say by nirtz. Remember again, we'll say, when do you get your ear pierced? When do you get your ear pierced? Right? Only after you've served an initial term of 6 years. So maybe it's only in that case where he's already served 6 years. Okay, now he got pierced. Now Yovel is just a couple of years later. That's when he goes free. So the Gemara says, maybe we should penalize him. Kamashlan, no. V'yashmo'ina nirsa. Had it just told me the case of the Eved who was pierced, mishum da'avid l'sheish, because it will say at least he has gone ahead and served 6 years. Aval machru Beis Din, delo avid l'sheish, who has not yet served 6 years. Emalo, perhaps he does not go free when Yovel comes just a couple of years into his servitude. Therefore, it needs to teach him in all cases. So I will say, bottom line is halacha l'maisa. Whenever Yovel comes, every Eved is going free. No matter what your particular circumstances, right? You were just sold in Yovel's now a couple of years later. You were just pierced, and now Yovel's just a couple of years later. You were sold by Beis Din, you sold yourself. Yovel essentially, again, is the great equalizer, right? What happens with Yovel is everything is reset. Everything is reset. So the Gemara says, "V'yitzrich lemichtav d'shavtem, v'yitzrich lemichtav li'olam." Also, I need both of these psukim. Why? Dikasev rachmana li'olam, hava mina li'olam mamish. I would have thought the olam ultimately means that he serves forever. Kasev rachmana v'shavtem. Therefore, the pasuk says, "No, Yovel comes, everyone goes free." Because of Rachmana v'shavtem, and the pasuk just said v'shavtem, hava mina hani milihecha delo avid sheish. I would have thought when, right? I'm sorry. Hani milihecha delo avid sheish. Aval hecha da avid sheish lo yehi sofo chamer mitchila. So I would have thought that's only true if he didn't yet serve 6 years. But if you already served 6 years, the end should be no more chamer than the beginning. Meaning what? Matchila so sheish. Just like in the beginning, he served 6. Av sofo sheish, so too in the end has to be 6 years as well. Kamash malon liolam, the olamo shel yovel. We'll say kamash malon, no, that Allah l'maisa the olam, when it says the nirtza, the Eved who's pierced serves forever. Forever means until when? Until yovel. Until yovel. No matter when yovel occurs after his piercing. So we'll say fine. So therefore, what comes out by from this whole exchange over here is again, Yovel is going to emancipate. So I will say, so whether again that's Yovel, so there are a couple of cases in which Yovel could emancipate. The simple, in general, when we speak about Yovel in Avdus, so the classic case is an Eved Ivri, whether he was. Now remember, the way the Rambam Paskin is that halacha l'maisa only an Eved sold by Beis Din has the ability to be a nirtza. Right? An Eved ultimately, again, who sells himself, doesn't have the ability to be pierced. So let's say again, an Eved is sold by Beis Din. In the classic case of Yovel, an Eved is sold by Beis Din, he serves his 6 years, he decides he wants to stay on. Right? What's the ability to do that? He gets his ear pierced, and now he's an Eved. He's an Eved until when? Until Yovel. Right? So that's the classic case. Now we're being introduced to, I will say, is, well, it's not the pshat that every Eved becomes an Eved Ivri on year 1 of the 50-year cycle. So you could have people becoming Avadim, and then Yovel's coming at all different times. So bottom line, I will say, what happens when Yovel comes? Emancipation. And it's irrelevant as to what year you are in your Avdus. As soon as Yovel comes, ultimately, again, you are emancipated. Whether you sold yourself, whether you're sold by Beis Din, whether you're pierced, you're not pierced, how far into the post-piercing term you are in, doesn't make a difference. Once Yovel comes, I will say, obviously, you could imagine that obviously the purchase price of the Eved reflected how far away Yovel was, right? If you were purchasing an Eved 2 years before Yovel, obviously, again, that was going to be reflected in the purchase price. But Lamaisa, once Yovel comes, everyone goes free. Incredible. Ella, we'll say last line, Tesvav Amud Aleph, Ella, man tanadol Yolev Sacher Zechus. We'll say, it's funny, like we keep going back to the same question. Okay, so who is the Tana that doesn't hold of the Gzir Shava of Sacher? To which the Gemara says, Rebbe. It's Rebbe, Tisanya, Amud Beis, V'im lo yigael ba'ela. So I'll say, so the pasuk says, if you will not be redeemed with these. I will say, so just to be clear, we're switching gears a little bit. This pasuk Rashi points out over here is talking about an Eved, a Jew, who was sold to a Gentile master. Sold to a Gentile master. I will say, now obviously, the goal of a Jew sold to a Gentile master, or I should say, our goal is to redeem him as quickly as possible, because the concern, of course, is that being owned by a Gentile master will preclude him from discharging his Judaic responsibilities. So the Gemara says, "Ve'im lo yiga'al ba'ela," if he cannot be redeemed through these other means, v'yatza b'shnas hayovel hu'u bana v'imo. So we'll say, so the Torah says, obviously the goal is the Eved should try to redeem himself. If he can't redeem himself, his relatives have to redeem him. If all else fails, the Eved goes free in Yovel. Interesting, the Eved goes free in Yovel. This is an evet owned by a Gentile master. Rabbi says, Be'elohu nigal, he is redeemed with these. And we'll say, these means, Rashi points out, Bekrovim. His relatives could redeem him. Ve'ein nigal b'sheish. But I will say, an evet sold to a Gentile master does not automatically go free after 6 years. So in other words, there are two mechanisms for freedom for a Jew sold to a Gentile. Either number one, he is redeemed by his relatives, right? Or B, Yovel. But there is no 6 year, there is no going free at the end of 6 years. You might have thought it's a kavachomer. Uma mishe'eno nigal be'ela, nigal b'sheish. We'll say other avadim who are not redeemed in these ways. In other words, I will say the concept of relatives redeeming you, right? Of an obligation upon relatives to redeem their family member who is an Eved only applies when the family member was sold to a Gentile master, right? If my relative is sold to a Jewish master, I have no obligation to redeem him. No obligation to redeem him. If he's sold to a Gentile master, I have an obligation to redeem him. Now, a typical Eved Ivri who is sold to a Jewish master, who's not redeemed, the relatives don't have an obligation to redeem him yet, he goes free after 6 years. This guy, who's the Jew, sold to a Gentile master, where there is an obligation upon his relatives to redeem him, I would have thought that it goes without saying that he goes free after 6 years. Talmud lomar ba'ela. Therefore, the pasuk is ba'ela. Ba'ela hu nigal ve'nigal b'sheish. Ultimately, the Eved sold to a Gentile master is redeemed ba'ela, either through his relatives or through Yovel, but ultimately does not go free after 6 years. So the Gemara says, that if you think that you subscribe to, if you would hold of Sacher, then on my Ka'amar, so we'll say, if we would subscribe to the Gzera Shava, look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi is the last white line on top. Nelev Sacher, Gulas Krovim, Lenimkar Lisrael, Minimkar La'ovid Kochavim. The Benimkar La'ovid Kochavim, Namiksiv Kisacher, Shalom. So we'll say, listen to this. If you hold the Gzera Shava of Sacher, it says Sachir by an Eved Ivri sold to a Jew, and it says Sachir ultimately again by an Eved Ivri sold to a Gentile. I would have said, just like the Jew goes free after 6 years, the Jew sold to a Gentile goes free after 6 years. So as I say, obviously the fact that we don't say that indicates that what? We do not subscribe to that Gzera Shavos. Here it is. Amram Nachar Yitzchak. Nachar says, no. The Olam Yaliv Sachir. No. Everyone holds of Sachir. For Shaindy Hacha. It's different over here. Why? The Amakra Yig Alenu. The pasuk says he shall be redeemed. Lazeh v'lo la'acher. Now, both say the Torah, when speaking about Yig Alenu, of the obligation of relatives to redeem the Eved Ivri, it says Yig Alenu. They will redeem him. This is Dafka Halacha that applies to an Eved sold to a Gentile master and not to one sold to a Jewish master. Shabbos says, this is really interesting. So now, we've kind of opened up now another front on this discussion. Up until now, we've been focusing on a Jewish servant sold to a Jewish master, either selling himself or sold by Beis Din. Now, what we've established is that servant goes free automatically after 6 years, or Yovel. Now, Rabbi say there is the Eved Ivri sold to a Gentile master. So what's his status? So here now the Gemara just told us, well, he doesn't go free after 6 years. He does not go free after 6 years. So when does he go free? So Rabbi say, it sounds like from the pasuk, either he goes free, number one, there is an obligation upon his family members to redeem him, upon immediate family to redeem him, to buy him out of servitude, or Yovel. Okay, so Uman Tanat the Paligalei Rabbi Yossi Aglili Rabbi Akiva. Who is the opinion ultimately again who argues on Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva? This Sanya, here we go. Lo Yigal Be'ela. Right? If he is not redeemed through these things. So we'll say, once again, we're still talking about the Eved sold to a Gentile master. So if his relatives don't redeem him, then ultimately he goes out during Yovel. Now, I know what you're thinking. 1 second, but he's sold to a Gentile master. So what does Yovel have to do with the Gentile master? Hold on to that. We're going to see. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yosef Lili says, be'ela l'shichror, b'shar kol adam l'shibud. Ultimately, again, I will say be'ela. Rashi says be'ela l'shichror, gu'alu krovim ve'enu mishtabed lahem. So this is very interesting. So Rabbi Yossi says like this. Let's call him Ruvain, right? So Ruvain is our Jew, is our Eved Ivri. Ruvain is sold to a Gentile master. Fine. Now the Torah says Ruvain's relatives have an obligation to go ahead and redeem him from servitude. What happens when they redeem him? So Rabbi Yossi Galili says, "Omer be'ela l'shichror." When his relatives redeem him, Ruvain is a free man. When redeemed from servitude, Ruvain is a free man. B'shar kol adam, if other people, i.e. non-relatives, redeem Ruvain, then what? He becomes their Eved Ivri. Fascinating, right? So if relatives redeem Ruvain from his Gentile master, he goes free. Other non-relatives redeem him, because we will say if the relatives don't redeem him, there is a mitzvah upon the community to redeem him from his servitude to a Gentile master. But if others redeem him, he becomes the servant, the Eved Ivri, of whoever redeemed him. Rabbi Akiva said, Be'ela l'shibud. Rabbi Akiva is just the opposite. If the relatives redeem him, he becomes the Eved Ivri to the relatives. B'shar kol adam l'shichror. But if other people, non-relatives, redeem him, then ultimately, again, he is emancipated. So what's the machlokas? This is incredible. My time is Rabbi Yossi. Why does Rabbi Yossi Galili say? So again, Rabbi Yossi Galili Shita, if relatives redeem him, he goes free. If other people redeem him, he is their Eved Ivri. He's their Eved Ivri. What's the logic? Amakra im lo yigal be'ela ela ba'acher. So again, the pasuk says, if he is not redeemed with these, i.e. if relatives don't redeem him, rather he's redeemed through someone else. So the Gemara says, Yatsa b'shnas hayovel. Torah says he remains a servant until Yovel, i.e., he becomes the Eved Ivri of the people who redeemed him. Rabbi Akiva says, Im lo yigal ela be'ela. Ultimately, again, if he is not redeemed only with these, v'yatsa b'shnas hayovel, then ultimately, again, he'll go out by the Yovel. Ivar Rabbi Yossi Aglili midi ela be'ela ksiv. By Rabbi Yossi Aglili, it doesn't say Eila, it says Be'ela. Ela b'hai kra kamifligi. Rather, Rabbi said the machlokas Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Akiva is in the following pasuk. O dodo, o ben dodo yigalenu. So we'll say, now watch this. The pasuk says either his uncle, right, or the son of his uncle, ultimately again will redeem the Eved Ivri. So zeh gu'ulas krovim. That ultimately again refers to redemption by relatives. By relatives, Zegulas Krovim, O Hisika Yado, or we'll say again, if the Eved himself has enough money, Zegulas Atzmo, that refers to redeeming yourself from servitude. Vinigal, or he's redeemed, Zegulas Achirim, that ultimately again refers to other people redeeming. So we'll say, this is just interesting. The pasuk itself, when you break it up, refers to three different mechanisms for redemption. So once more, Ododo ben dodo refers to redemption through your relatives. Remember, this is talking about a Jew, Eved Ivri, sold to a Gentile master. Three mechanisms for redemption. Either your family redeems you, Ododo o ben dodo yigalenu, right? O hesiga yado, or you have enough money, which means you could buy yourself out of servitude, right? Or lastly, vinigal, or he is redeemed. Who is redeemed? Who is that? Other people. Other people are redeeming you. Fine. So we'll say those are the three parts of the puzzle. Now watch this. Rabbi Yossi Aglili Savar. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, Mikra nidrash lefanav. Rabbi Yossi says, when darshaning a pasuk, right, every phrase sheds light on the one in front of it. Watch this. Therefore, shadi gulas krov gulas atzmo. Go ahead, Rabbi say, literally apply the concept of redemption by relatives to the redemption, to self-redemption. Ma gu'ulas asmo l'shichror, just like when the Eved redeems himself, he goes free. Af gu'ulas krovim l'shichror, so too when redeemed by relatives, he also goes free. And I will say, therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, only when he is redeemed by others, then halacha l'maisa, he remains an Eved. Rabbi Akiva savar, mikra nidrash la'acharav. Rabbi Akiva says, no. Every phrase sheds light on the one before it. He says as follows. He says, Shadei gu'ulas achirim agu'ulas atzmo. Explain, or I should say connect, the concept of redemption by others to the redemption of the self. Magulas asma l'shechrer, just like when you redeem yourself, ultimately you're free. Af gulas acherim l'shechrer, so to Allah l'mais, when other people redeem you, you also go free. Ihachi be'ela lamali. If that's the case, why don't you the phrase be'ela, the word be'ela, to which the Gemara says, ilav be'ela, word not for be'ela, hava amina nikra nidrash bein lefana bein la'acharav. I would have thought the pasuk, every phrase, darshins, or I should say, sheds light on the one before it and after it, v'hakol shechrer. And ultimately, again, every time, no matter what the mechanism of emancipation, the Eved always goes free. Ihachi hadar kushla duchte. If that's the case, I will say our question goes back to its original place. Ella bisvara kameflagi. Rather, I will say you have to say you're actually not arguing about a pasuk, rather arguing about svara. We'll say what's a svara? It's fascinating. So we'll say, you're right. Then Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yosef Lili are not arguing on how to darshan a pasuk. They're arguing on logic. Listen to this. Rabbi Yosef Lili savar mistabra guula sachira meshibur. Rabbi Yosef Lili says it has to be that when other people, non-relatives, redeem the Eved Ivri from his Gentile master, that the Eved ultimately again is going to be their Eved. Why? The Amrit l'Shechrer havamini v'lo parkile. He'll say, if when other non-relatives redeem the Eved Ivri is going to go free, then I'll say, what's going to happen? No one's going to do it. Why should I redeem someone who's not my relative? So essentially, I'm going to go ahead and lose money. I don't get anything from it. If you tell me I redeem him from servitude to the Gentile master, and what? He becomes my Eved Ivri, that's an investment. I'm willing to do that. Rabbi Akiva mistabra gulas krovim l'shibud. Rabbi Akiva says, no. It must be that when the relatives redeem him, he becomes their Eved Ivri. Why? Di'i amrit l'shichr, because we'll say ultimately again, if you say he would go free, kol yoma v'yoma azil umaz bin nafshay. This guy is going to go and sell himself each and every day. In other words, we'll say, if I know that if I sell myself into servitude to a Gentile master, that's what? My relatives always have an obligation to bail me out. Then what I will say, this could become a very lucrative business, right? I could keep on selling myself, make a little bit of money, and my relatives are always on the hook to go ahead and redeem me. However, if I become the Eved of my relatives, suddenly it's not such a pasha situation. So if Rabbi say, we end off with a fascinating machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yosef Lili. So again, remember, we've now switched gears to talking about the Eved who is sold ultimately again sold to a Gentile master. So now Rabbi say, we know we have three mechanisms of redemption. Number one, a mitzvah upon relatives to do so, right? The Eved could always redeem himself, and halacha l'maisa, others could redeem him. What happens now when family, and obviously if he redeems himself, he's free. What happens if relatives or family members do it? So here we have Rabbi Yosef Lili says that halacha l'maisa, when non-family redeems him, he goes free. When family redeems him, when family redeems him, he goes free. When others redeem him, ultimately again, he becomes their Eved. Rabbi Yosef Lili says, otherwise, you have to incentivize others to emancipate him. Otherwise, they're not going to do it. What's the incentive? They get an Eved. Rabbi Akiva says, no, just the opposite. Ultimately, when family redeems him, he becomes their servant. When others redeem him, ultimately, again, he goes free. What's the logic? Because we're concerned that the Eved is going to exploit this, knowing that family always has to redeem him. Therefore, he'll keep getting himself into this mess. And halacha l'maisa, he'll keep on becoming an Eved. In order to disincentivize this, if family redeems him, ultimately becomes their Eved. We'll stop over here for today. Who we paskin like halacha l'maisa, and Eretz Yisrael we'll see tomorrow. Shkoyach.